My name is Ian Howard, I'm Principal of Edinburgh College of Art, and I welcome you all here today. We're delighted to welcome another Animation Studies event on the back of last year's very successful hosting of the Society of Animation Studies Conference. It's good to see many returning faces and welcome to new ones. Animated Realities is an academic conference hosted jointly by the University of Edinburgh and Edinburgh College of Art, with a screening programme of new animated documentary work as part of the 65th Edinburgh International Film Festival. Our organisers state that this event offers an opportunity to discuss and explore further the emergent field of animated documentary, a hybrid audiovisual landscape characterised by blurred boundaries and unexplored territories. Edinburgh College of Art hosting a conference event on animated documentary filmmaking is appropriate given our research and teaching excellence in the fields of both animation through our animation department and live action documentary film through FTV and the Scottish Documentary Institute. In fact, the fact that this conference is a partnership between ourselves and the Edinburgh International Film Festival further cements the college's long-standing ties with the festival, where our staff, students and graduates have a distinguished track record of success, exhibiting films, winning prizes and running a range of film industry and theoretical workshops and other related events. Finally, this conference is a collaboration, as I said, between Edinburgh College of Art and the University of Edinburgh, both in terms of research interests and expertise, and also financially. We see this as a precursor of many of the new research projects and initiatives and increased capacity which will flow from the formal merger between the college and the university, which takes place in just over a month's time on the 1st of August. My colleague, Professor Richard Coyne, is sitting in the second row of the audience, but I'm going to ask him to come up and add his welcome to this conference. But have a great day and enjoy yourselves.
Thanks for warming up the rostrum. Welcome to everyone on behalf of the University of Edinburgh. I'm head of the School of Arts, Culture and Environment, which is soon to be merged with ECA, and I'll be demitting office. The programme for this conference fascinates me. It's another cut through the world of digital media, which is my area of interest and specialism. We've been using digital animation as a way of encouraging and fostering skills among our design and digital media and sound design students and researchers. We've been looking at 3D modelling, developing resources for the web, visualisation, sonification, digital design, interaction design. It's quite a list: desktop publishing, mobile ubiquitous media, social media, crowdsourcing, citizen journalism, theories and philosophies of new media, etc. Well, this conference opens my eyes to the potential of animation and animated non-fiction and documentary, which is new to me. As I conducted my own bit of research prior to this event, two major technical innovations leapt out at me. The first is the power of online distribution media, such as Vimeo, that brings all this work to public awareness in very accessible ways for both producers and audiences. The second innovation, I think, is the power of digital post-processing. For example, using Adobe After Effects and similar to provide amazing compositing of images from every source conceivable and the exercise of very precise control over images and layers. Notable in animation is the dynamic control of focus and depth of field, blurring and sharpening of layers in an image, enhancing depth and dynamism in the cinematic experience. So perhaps layering depth focus, these are leitmotifs of animated documentary. Anyway, I'm an audience member rather than a practitioner of the arts, theories and politics of animated documentary. So congratulations to the organisers, Nia Ehrlich and Jonathan Murray, and to you all for putting together such a fascinating programme of presentations. So I bid you welcome, and I look forward to the conference. Thank you.
Right, good morning everybody. I probably shouldn't be saying anything because I'm the only person in the room who hasn't the time to put on his name badge, not pick up a bag yet. My name's Johnny Murray. I'm one of the co-organisers of this event. We're delighted to welcome you all here and hope that you have a pleasant and stimulating 2 days. Just in addition to Ian and Richard's very helpful remarks, the toilets are downstairs. If you head directly down the stairs and then turn and down the next flight and into your right. And just a couple of other housekeeping points. You should all have picked up a delegate pack, I hope. If you registered and paid in advance, you should also have been given a receipt for your payment. So if you didn't get a chance to collect that, please ask at the main desk. In terms of what's in your bag, obviously you have the conference brochure and the abstract documents which we sent out to you in advance, but you now have hard copies of those. We're delighted to be doing this event in partnership with the Edinburgh International Film Festival and to be able to include curated film screenings of new animated documentary work in the evenings. We are also aware, however, that it does make for a long day and conferences can be as enervating as they are stimulating. So just to say to you all, as well as lunch, and again, if you, actually about the catering, if you specified any specific requirements or allergies to us, we should have separate named plates of food for you at the lunch breaks. We're putting on a snack with the afternoon tea break, and then at the drinks reception, after tonight's film The Green Wave, there will also be more sandwiches. So obviously if by that point in the day you just literally want to find a restaurant or you want to have a quick drink, and we completely understand that we have tried to build in some minor grazing points throughout the day just to keep you going. One other thing, wireless access has been arranged. The member of IT staff here at Edinburgh College of Art who's helping with that has given me a small set of instructions. I'm going to leave the room briefly to translate these instructions. And I think what the easiest thing for me to do, rather than say, do this, do that, do the other, is probably just to print them up on a sheet. So if you ask for wireless access, I'll bring a sheet at the end of Paul's session, and I won't keep Paul any longer than I have to, and just distribute those as you leave the main lecture theatre. In terms of our first tea and coffee break, we're just back out this door, turn right, walk straight along onto the sculpture court balcony, and teas and coffees will be set up on your left-hand side. Once again, thanks on behalf of Nia and myself for your support and contribution to the event, because obviously if you weren't here, it wouldn't be here. We are filming proceedings, so if there's anything which you don't see, because it's taking place in another room, we hope to be able to make conference material available to you online or by DVD at some point in the autumn. We will also hope to produce some kind of scholarly anthology out of the proceedings over the next couple of days. So again, that's something that we will be keeping you posted on in the coming months. It struck me often over the last few months that organising a conference must be a bit like entering into the sacrament of marriage. You learn a huge amount from the first one. I hope our mistakes and oversights won't be too visible over the next couple of days. As I say, we're delighted that you're here and we hope you have a great time in Edinburgh. Thank you. And without further ado, I'd like to, I'm delighted to say that our conference today opens with a keynote from Dr. Paul Watts. Paul.
Thank you everybody. I should say that again, but thank you everybody so far. Nice intros, and I should say I welcome the blast of cold air that is descending on me. I'm from Bournemouth. I thought people in Edinburgh were more hardy, and everybody's kind of talking about the cold air, and I'm kind of bracing and enjoying it like a sort of Newcastle United fan, as you see on Match of the Day with no shirts on. Okay, let me just line things up here. And I'd just like to say, before I start, in your delegate packs, which I had nothing to do with putting together, but you'll also find a small card that Nicola Dobson was instrumental in putting in. You just put your hand up in. Society for Animation Studies has already been mentioned. We were in this very institution a year ago for our annual conference. I'm the current president of the SAS, and if anybody is interested in joining, I know lots of you are current members or have been members in the past, you might want to talk to either me or Nicola during the course of proceedings, and there's a URL, website and so forth included in the conference pack. So, without further ado, I'd also like to thank Johnny and Nia for inviting me. It's a great honour to kick off the event. Some of you will know my work, some of you maybe not, if you're coming from a more practical sort of background. I'm not a practitioner, I'm a film media kind of historian and theorist who's moved into animation. I've written a fair amount about live action documentary and animation and putting the two together. So my work's indebted to people like Paul Wells, Gunnar Strong. Gunnar's not with us today, Paul is, Bella Holmes-Rowe, who was with us as well, all of whom have written about animated documentaries. And thinkers from the world of documentary studies, Bill Nichols, Brian Winston, Stella Brooksy, John Corner, and I could extend that list a great deal further. Today, the aim is pretty modest, I think. I'd like to talk about these 3 P's, performance, practice and pedagogy, and how they might encourage us to rethink some of our assumptions and approaches towards animated documentary, and, as it were, to set the scene for the excellent set of papers that are to follow. So, first of all, I'd like to talk about how animated performance functions in relation to non-fiction films. I'm interested in the act of animating, the performative nature of animating, in the context of films that are based on real-world stories, and self-consciously engage with their factual basis. So, Stella Brooksy has summarised some of the problems of performance and the performative in documentary. In realist drama documentary, the actors' performances serve the purpose of, quote, authenticating the fictionalisation, end quote. The performative documentary, on the other hand, and this is another quote from Brooksy, uses performance within a non-fiction context to draw attention to the impossibilities of authentic documentary representation. The performative element within the framework of non-fiction is thereby an alienating distancing device, not one which actively promotes identification and a straightforward response to a film's content. End quote. So documentary animation is built on a highly reflexive performativity that foregrounds process and construction. And this is the logical conclusion of what Brooksy refers to as the performative element, in the sense that it thereby foregrounds alienation and distance. The viewer's position whilst watching an animated film that purports to be about real events and real people is therefore an odd and ambivalent one. An animated version of the scene is arguably merely another kind of reconstruction, but one that draws more direct and specific attention to itself as a reconstruction. Annette Hill has usefully examined documentaries' multiple modes of engagement and emphasised that viewers will respond to documentaries' material in a wide variety of ways. And Hill's discussion makes use of what I'm putting up here, John Corner's distinction between looking at and looking through, where the latter, quote, involves a reflexive mode of engagement. It's an observation of ourselves experiencing something. Through second-order observation, we can could transform the experience, taking it to an imaginary space without losing touch with what is real about the experience to begin with. I'd like to develop some of Hill's points about viewer engagement with documentary and the performative as outlined by Brooksy by opening up the concept of performance. Donald Crafton, the famous animation scholar, makes a distinction between performance in animated films and the performance of animation, animation as a procedure or as a practice, as I'll come back to later. And Crafton's paper follows performance studies pioneer Richard Schechner's discussion of performance in order to understand how animation and performance are interrelated. Schechner proposes that all actions can be viewed as performances, distinguishing between, on the one hand, framed events or formal performances, which he labels is performance, and the actions and rituals of everyday life, which he labels as performance. As performance, both words in inverted commas. In the sense that one can and should view these naturalised actions as performances, rather than just things that happen. So Crafton's play on in-of animation is therefore a critical echoing of Schechner's is as performance. And documentary, to my mind anyway, problematises the notions of is performance and as performance, though Schechner makes it clear he's talking about a spectrum of activity rather than discrete categories. But it problematises this by recasting everyday actions as an entirely different kind of performance, namely documentary performance. This recasting is of a different order once again. Once we're talking about reenactment in documentary, and I would say of a different order once again when we're talking about animated documentary. I'd like to contextualise some of these ideas in relation to a recent film that was made by Joe Shear. I'm delighted he's here in the audience. Joe made this film at the Arts University College, Bournemouth. The film's entitled The 10 Mark. Joe's film is a stop-motion puppet animation film about British serial killer John Christie, whose story is most well known from the film 10 Rillington Place, in which Richard Edinburgh played John Christie. Joe's film takes the form of a series of slow-moving vignettes inside Christie's house. It's dark, foreboding, creepy and uncanny. We hear things off-screen, I hope we do when I play it, because it was very quiet earlier. But, we hear things off-screen, closing door, creaking stair maybe. You can hear the London Underground train in some scenes. Christie's house was very near to the London Underground. But we tend not to see anything much. The figure of Christie is often obscured in the shadows. There's no exposition, dialogue or voiceover explaining the enormity of Christie's crimes or trying to get inside his head. So how, if at all, does this animated film work as a documentary or as a non-fiction? Well, Joe's research procedure, he made this film as part of an MA project, obsessively detailed and factual. Many hours of research in archives at Kew, various court records, the newspaper libraries at Colindale in London, along with field trips to Lapwood Grove in West London, which was where Rillington Place was located until the house was demolished. His construction of sets is likewise painstaking and verging on the obsessive. Makes you sound like a bit of a weirdo, Joe. Sorry about that. But animators are weird, let's face it. So. The approach to this stop-motion animated film is to explore detail, nuance and atmosphere, the dark and dank interiors, a picture of Christie's mother on the wall, a tea tray that was found abandoned in the kitchen and can be seen in police photographs of the house after Christie was arrested. In the film you can see this tray slide ominously to the floor. In many ways the film deals in and focuses on the incidental details, the things that seem unimportant but are nevertheless facts of the matter. As Joe pointed out to me, quote, the film is not about the murders or why he murdered. I'm interested in what his banal everyday actions symbolise to us, end quote. Clearly one of the pleasures of watching and indeed making animation is that we know that what we're watching or creating is a completely constructed world. Everything is built, rendered and fashioned, or to use another term, performed, by the unseen hands of the animator. As I've already noted, animation is a peculiarly performative process, and animating constitutes a particular form of performance or action, the giving of life to inanimate objects and things. In the case of animation that's representing real events, the facts depicted are unavoidably read through the lens of the fact that an animator has intervened, interpreted and incrementally built up the factual world that we're viewing. Now I'm going to show, Johnny said he'd hit the lights, but he's out in Wi-Fi Ville, so hit the lights and I will just check. Hopefully this will be loud enough and won't feed back on us. It's just a couple of minutes from Joe's film. It's very quiet and very dark. So, yeah. Okay, thank you. As I say, very quiet, but deliberately so. Okay. So, you know, you can see from that film very, very kind of slow, dark, contemplative, and you know, not a lot going on. It's certainly not trying to explain events in any kind of way. And one objection that could be raised is, you know, how do we know this is who it's meant to be, and what kind of context are we watching this? But I mean, these are questions that can be raised about any non-fictional film. You know, if you don't know in any detail who the subject is and so on. So, but I mean, those are debates that we can have over the next couple of days and ongoing. Just to continue then, Laura Ivins-Hulley addresses some of the issues that I've been talking about in an article about performance in fictional stop-motion puppet animation. And she emphasises that the puppet has an existence outside of the film, whilst its movement, as with all animation, only exists at the point of projection. This is a point that Suzanne Buchan's made in various publications as well, particularly about the Coyne brothers' work. And for Ivins-Hulley, this means that the viewer plays a vital role in co-constituting the performances, precisely because, following Richard Bauman's thinking, quote, to perform is to perform for someone who recognises the performance to be such. End quote. So in an animated film such as The 10 Mark, or a film that many more of you will have actually seen, Peter Lord's Going Equipped, both films that rely, albeit in very different ways, on a direct link to a real person, so that their representational strategies can be interpreted as non-fictional. The viewer's recognition of the animatedness of the puppet or plasticine figure means that the notion of something being performed for someone is displaced onto, or at least shared by, the process of animating. The acting, the performing, the motions are all done by or communicated by the animator, rather than the figure itself as an actor with its own agency. And therefore, fundamental to understanding a film like The 10 Mark is a recognition of the performative nature of animation, and peculiar ways in which animation is a record of not just what passes before the camera, but of much else besides. Now, much of the preceding discussion touches on the notion of practice, the second of my P's, but does so indirectly via the idea of it being linked to a particular kind of performativity on the part of the animator. Clearly there are ways that people work or create certain artefacts, and this is referred to in a common sense way as their practice. Performance and practice can therefore be seen, perhaps imprecisely, as synonyms or terms that overlap to a great degree. Mike Wayne has opened up the notion of documentary filmmaking, though he doesn't talk specifically about animation, as to view it as a form of critical and creative research. A documentary as a critical and creative research. And I would like to argue in the remainder of the presentation that the actions and practice of animators who are working in documentary need to be especially alive to what he says. Underpinning his points are for me two further P's, very alliterative when I was writing this, but the notion of penetration, as first defined by John Alice and Joy Batchelor, but more recently brought into animation studies, the animation studies arena by Paul Wells, and politics, not the debased sense of party politics, it's more alliteration coming up, professionalised political posturing, but the old-fashioned sense of a political consciousness and conscience. In other words, why are we doing these things? Why are we making films about the real world using animation? What kind of critical tools are we bringing to bear, and for what purpose? Now, Wayne makes the connection between two apparently opposing research traditions. On the one hand, the positivist empirical paradigm where the real world is straightforwardly recorded, captured and documented, and on the other hand, the interpretive paradigm, which emphasises the qualitative ebb and flow of experience. As Wayne points out, examples of methodologies within the interpretive paradigm are symbolic interactionism, phenomenology, hermeneutics, psychoanalysis, and ethnography. I'm glad to hear I'm not going to trawl through what all of these mean in this paper, but despite their differences, all these methodologies share an emphasis on the way human subjects creatively imbue their activities and interactions with culturally constructed meanings, end quote. So of course we don't have to work too hard to see here what might be construed as a simple and frankly simplistic dichotomy for those discussing how animation impacts on documentary as a field of activity. That is, that the positivist paradigm can be linked to, and its traces seen in, documentary films that are constructed around models of observation, showing things as they actually are, not how they might seem. Whereas the interpretive paradigm can be linked to, as Wayne suggests, interpretation, culturally constructed meanings, and so on. The indexicality of the live action image appears to marry it to a notion of empirical capture, whilst animation does the work of representing interpretations, and often fanciful ones at that, dreams, memories, fantasies, or other altered mind states, as a number of the papers in the coming days will tell us. Another way of putting this is that live action documentary is often overly concerned with ideologies of the visible, or what can be directly seen or witnessed. Animated documentary is more concerned with the invisible, the obscured. I feel waves of objection already coming towards me. But it's a friend of mine who has a saying, everything before the word but is bullshit. But this simple dichotomy, this simplistic dichotomy needs qualifying. That's what I'm now going to do, hopefully, after that build-up. Documentary scholar and filmmaker Michael Shannon points out some of the problems with what he calls filming the invisible. Some of a very good anthology essay in Rethinking Documentary. And he notes that there are different kinds of invisibility, from things that are literally physically obscured from view, and he gives the example of the proverbial black cat in a coal hole, to things that are not visible to the documentary filmmaker because they've already occurred. And Shannon's example here is of a palace coup in Panama. The eagle-eyed, or indeed Chilean amongst you will know that that's actually not Panamanians, that's Pinochet and some of his cronies after they overthrew Allende in the 70s. I'm doing what a lot of documentary filmmakers do, which is taking an indexable trace of one thing and using it to stand in for something else, but with much controversy often. But in the case of Michael Shannon, he arrived in Panama, as I say, as a filmmaker as well as Professor of Film at Roehampton University at the moment. And he arrived after it had happened and tried to work out how can I represent this event, that I've come to film directly. Now it's not visible to me. And we could easily extend that notion of invisibility to include historical events that occurred many years prior to wanting to make a film about them. Making a documentary about the French Revolution or whatever it might be. As with Wayne, Shannon does not talk about any animated examples, but his attention to the question of how documentaries reveal things that are not immediately visible, social processes, historical trajectories, strikes me as being of specific importance for animators, particularly animators who are working in a non-fictional realm. So at one point, Shannon invokes the wind as something that is not itself physically present or visible, but it is, of course, discernible in the way it moves things. As Shannon puts it, quote, some things, like the wind, can be shown through the visible signs of their effects, end quote. And one of the first practical exercises that animation students learn, certainly at the Arts University College Bournemouth anyway, is the flag wave, a simple cycle exercise to work out how to keyframe and in between. Central to this exercise is the realisation that you're not really animating a flag at all. You're animating the wind and its effects on the flag. The key principles of weight, anticipation, timing, compression, in my view, these are not simple principles of animation practice, or not only animation practice, but can be seen as principles underpinning the historical process. The breath of life, get a bit poetic here, bear with me. Breath of life in animation echoes the breath of life that drives historical forces. Now, all that sounds a bit fanciful, maybe. Maybe not. Maybe you're with me. Maybe you're dreamers as well and you're with me. Maybe some of you aren't. No. Maybe it sounds like I've had some single malt on my cornflakes. I didn't. I had porridge. Or I'm feeling particularly proud of my animation students and want to place them at the vanguard of history. That's certainly the case. I'm very proud of my students. But as Shannon notes, social processes are invisible. Often they're deliberately obscured by governments and corporations. And history, quoting Shannon, refuses to present itself promptly in front of the camera, but remains an absent cause, with the consequence that the signs of its effects are at best amorphous, ambiguous and open to interpretation, end quote. So for Shannon and for scholars like Mike Wayne and someone else who has written brilliantly about animation, specifically Esther Leslie, this means that practitioners need to be attuned to the ways in which hidden forces can be made visible, which is to say how complex and often contradictory things around us clash, flow and synthesise, in short, a dialectical notion of images and representations. And Shannon notes Walter Benjamin's view of the technique of montage, which most people will be familiar with, maybe not Benjamin's quote on it, but the technique of montage. And he quotes Benjamin saying it interrupts the context. The image interrupts the context into which it is inserted and thus counteracts illusion, end quote. So for Shannon then, Benjamin was, again quoting, interested in images as emblematic traces removed from the historical continuum, which could be reactivated through juxtaposition, end quote. Now in her book, Hollywood Flatlands, Esther Leslie talks at one point about the Dadaist Francis Picabia, who, writing in 1923 and with characteristically Dadaist zeal, rails against, quote, the morality of an imbecilic age, and champions the virtues of erasure. And he says, quote, we should efface our works and the memory of them. Our brain should be a mirror in which we would see ourselves for a moment, only to turn our backs. Now, I love that quote because it's, there's another quote from Picabia which he says at one point, my arse contemplates those who talk behind my back. I like that. That's kind of a Dadaist version of talk to the hand. Talk to the arse. So he's interested in erasure and having thoughts and then kind of, you know, turning your back on them. And there he is, sitting in a toy car. See what I've done there? I've taken an image of Francis Picabia and I've juxtaposed it with this wonderful quote, and then I've kind of made him look. He'd love this, by the way. He would love the kind of, you know, the intention that I have of kind of throwing his ideas into sharp relief. And he chose to sit in the car, so he must have had somebody take a photo of him, so he must have known this might happen at some point. Maybe he did, maybe, you know, he was living in the moment. But. So Leslie runs with this provocative image, not the image of him in the car, but the idea of people having ideas and then turning their back on them, which is a provocative image, noting that it reminds her of Hegel's description of thinking as, quote, always the negation of what we have immediately before us. So the perversely, it's more alliteration, perversely playful exhortations of Picabia do of course capture one fundamental element of animation, or some animation at least, its ability to draw, redraw, erase, reinscribe. But it's no surprise to see in Leslie's book anyway, liking sketch artists or someone like Emile Cole invoked, the rapid transformations of this kind of animation fitting the bill here. Now I'm interested in how we might harness the energy to which Leslie alludes while simultaneously working with animation as a practice, as a performative process as discussed in relation to films like The 10 Mark. So that's not to say that I want all animated documentaries to be slow and contemplative, like The 10 Mark, or indeed frenetically transformative, like a cold film or a lightning sketch routine. Rather, it's to emphasise that the teaching of animation, animation pedagogy, is for me a vital component of progression to a more thoroughgoing understanding of not only animation itself, but also the social processes and realities that it has a hand in representing. Now, the notion of thinking as negation sounds pretty negative, not to put too fine a point on it. And surely, you know, this day and age where we power of positive thinking and so on and so forth, we're all in this together, as some public school boy never tires of telling us. Negation sounds like a kind of, you know, we don't want to be miserable and negative about things. Again, though, this is not being negative in that simplistic sense, obviously. Rather, we're talking about a dialectical way of thinking, where each idea or proposition is contradicted or negated by its opposite, the thesis negated by its antithesis, thereby leading to a new way of thinking or synthetic understanding. Now, Bella Honess Row, I don't have any pictures of you, Bella, in a toy car. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any, but I know they're out there. I will track them down. Bella Honess Row, in what is to date, this is a challenge obviously for everybody, what is to date the most detailed and in-depth analysis of animated documentary has characterised this as a dialectical relationship between absence and excess. And as she explains, this means that animated documentaries encourage us to negotiate the absence of convention. I'll start back again. Encourages us to negotiate the absence of conventionally visually indexable material and excess of the animation aesthetic, which is often highly non-realistic and or symbolic. Through this negotiation, we're presented with a rich and complex viewing experience that broadens the epistemological capacities of the documentary. End quote. So animated representations of real-world events and people have an immediate and inbuilt scepticism, because we cannot take them simply at face value. The ontological status, that's Christie's tray falling somewhere again, isn't it? The ontological status of the images often contrasts with the indexicality of the sound in those films that use real interviews as a basis. The aforementioned Going Equipped would be a good example there, but there's countless other examples, obviously, of animated documentaries that use interviews with real people as the basis, the jumping off point for visual interpretation. Or the heightened artificiality of the surface of the images emphasises the contingency and constructiveness of what we're looking at. In short, animation is used as a form of intellectual irritant or catalyst for critical thought. So take, for example, some of the films of American-born UK documentarist and National Film and Television School graduate Emily James, who uses parody and satire alongside the juxtaposition of animation, live action, puppets, diagrams and songs to draw out the contradictions of some everyday things that we take for granted. In this case, I'm not going to show it from this, but the convoluted mesh of trade tariffs, subsidies, banking deals and other chicanery hidden behind the farming and production of the US peanut in the biggest nut in the world, which is a film that you can view online, and I would recommend it to you if you haven't already seen it. Likewise, when we view Margot Sakiri's Scanactovic's short film My Mother's Coat, there's a beautiful use of drawn animation with loose lines overlapping to communicate the reality of how memory functions. As the animator says, my work lies in observation of movement, behaviour, relationships and conversations. I use my sketchbooks as a source of my observation, observing the subject more than the paper, allowing them to have space to themselves, spontaneity and improvisation of movement, as well as ambiguity of their motives. And again, I'm not going to show a bit from Margot's film, because Megan Gilbride's got a presentation on this very film, so I presume she'll be showing bits of it. So we should note here the importance of indexicality. In live-action, photographically based documentary, the indexable link is to the pro-filmic reality, the events and people that pass directly before the camera. Whereas, quoting Bella Honess Rowe again, according to Honess Rowe, a material causal link between pro-filmic and filmic in animation must reside in the materiality of the image, rather than with some observable reality that once took place in front of the camera. In Aardman's animated films, a sign of a finger or thumb imprinted on the clay of a puppet is a marker of the hand that created it. In hand-drawn or painted animation, the grain of the paint or the stroke of a pencil bears the trace of its original inscription on the paper or cell that was later filmed. The animated moving image carries an indexable weight of its own and brings with it the presence of the filmmaker. Now, coming to a conclusion, these musings on indexicality, critical thinking, observation, dialectics, and how we might represent the complexities of concrete reality bring us to the meeting point of the three things I've tried to link today, namely performance, practice, and now pedagogy. Anyone who's done a teaching qualification can usually tell there's a haunted look in their eyes. Will be familiar with the experiential learning model of educational theorist David Coyne. It foregrounds knowledge and learning about the world as part of a cycle consisting of 4 interpenetrating stages. And Wilma de Jong, who co-edited Rethinking Documentary with Thomas Austin, she's written an article that appears in the journal Media Practice about her teaching of live action documentary. And she applies Kolb's model there, so that's something to have a look at if you're interested in this. But yeah, there's 4 interpenetrating stages. There's concrete experience, what Kolb refers to as feeling, reflective observation or watching, abstract conceptualization, thinking, and finally active experimentation or doing. And as I say, these 4 stages are, saying that one has primacy over the others, they're interpenetrating and interlinked. Now, I don't have time to discuss this in great detail. Kolb's model suggests that learning styles can be mapped onto a grid, and so that people can understand what kind of learner they are. This isn't an exact science, but has some utility. So, for example, some people, when learning how to do something, will stand back, observe, and watch carefully before trying it, which would be their term, reflective observation. Other people, they'll leap straight in, try it out, see what it's like, learn by doing. In other words, active experimentation. You can already be thinking, I'm a bit more towards that side of it. I'm a bit more kind of cautious and reflective before I'll, anybody who's, deals with writer's block. You know, you can kind of rationalise yourself. Yeah, I'm reflective. You know, just get on and write, will you? You know, you need to finish this. So it can be a prevaricating tool, I guess. But so within any learning experience, however, each of these four modes or positions will feature at some point, but may have different emphasis from person to person and situation to situation. Now, I'd argue that animation, especially animation that deals in real-world events and people, is the ultimate in a way, taking a step back and reflecting, reconceptualising and experimenting on how to represent instances of concrete reality. It certainly has the potential for that watchword of modernist thinkers, ostraneni, or making strange, taking something about the world and forcing viewers to see it in a new way. So, for example, you know, what are we to make of a short film, one of the ones that will be shown in the special screening, Nina Savannah's The Stitches Speak, which uses embroidery and textiles to tell the animated story of considerable poverty, social upheaval and war. As a simple but devastatingly effective strategy of making the basis of the animation textile and embroidery work created by the people we can hear on the soundtrack. It's a similar technique was used some years before by Tim Webb in his landmark film from 1992, A is for Autism, which used drawings by autistic people. We also hear a clear example of what I was referring to earlier, the notion of images and voices being reactivated through juxtaposition. It was taking two things that you perhaps wouldn't normally expect to be together, forcing them together and coming up with a creative synthesis. So talking here of pedagogy should therefore not simply be limited to how we teach animation or how we teach documentary as craft, you know, the how to do it side of things. It should also include the ways in which documentary and animation scholars, students and practitioners can learn from how the other discipline or community of practice problematises some of the things that they take for granted, as well as how their theories and practices interconnect or clash with a web of potential interdisciplinary positions. So, revisiting Cole's model, I therefore add a fifth stage or orientation, that of critical juxtaposition, something that takes elements It's a test, is it? Test of my nerve. Didn't move. He didn't move an inch. Was the last line of his obituary. Okay. Where was I? The old water drink covers a multitude of sins. If it was a fire, I would have used it. Okay, right. So I'm adding a fifth, got Cole's model and critical juxtaposition, something that takes elements of the other four. So you've got experience, observation, conceptualisation, experimentation, but looks to place them in highly productive tension. So I'm thinking critical juxtaposition there in the middle with a set of arrows and this notion of animating, not just animating as you know the physical process of doing animation that animation practitioners do, but also the idea of animation as a kind of you know, animating your thought in a critical way. So animators are already masters of what I'm calling critical juxtaposition. Myriad skills in life drawing, observation and distillation of the essence of a scene or character, thinking about how particular actions look, as well as how they feel when acted out, experimenting with all manner of art making, technical and digital know-how. To be an animator is truly to be a remarkable all-rounder. What it also demands, this notion of critical juxtaposition, is an ability to do something that the sociologist of education, Basil Bernstein, who I've mentioned in some of my previous work, he identified as recontextualisation. Simply put, an ability to, quote, appropriate other discourses and bring them into a special relation with each other for the purposes of their selection, transmission and acquisition, end quote. Now, Bernstein's theoretical and empirical work mapped out how the secondary school curriculum in the UK rested on a stratified, recontextualising field where practical knowledge, for example, skills and creativity of carpentry and joinery, became recontextualised as part of school-based teaching. In this case, the limited set of skills that is woodwork in the school curriculum. So in this regard, Bernstein's notion of recontextualisation would be seen as a pejorative. Another test. We've got somebody who does this sort of thing where I work. Everybody hates him. Okay. It's a necessary thing to have fire alarm tests. Okay, so if you've got carpentry and joinery, that myriad set of skills, and then they're kind of distilled down into something that can be transmitted and acquired by the fairly bored school children. So that was Bernstein's kind of context that he was working in, but I'm kind of trying to take some of what he was talking about and see how it works in relation to higher education and something that he wasn't talking about, animation. So in this regard, Bernstein's notion of recontextualisation could be seen as a pejorative where real knowledge and creativity is transformed or diluted into a school's version or a curriculum. And in the instrumentalising forces at work in the reform of higher education institutions, in the UK at least, where everything is seemingly put in the service of an extremely limited employability agenda, which appears to take the needs of business and finance as self-evident to be served at any cost. We can certainly see a good deal about which to be nervous and vocally critical. Despite all this, I'd like to end, before the fire alarm goes off again, on a note of optimism and a definite sense of working towards the notion of recontextualisation as a positive force, not just within the fields of cultural production we identify as animation and documentary, nor just in the place where these two meet for animated documentary. I would like to see the dialectical reconstruction of ideas symbolised by the dynamism of animated documentaries taken forward into the broader social context, so that our performances as social agents, our practice and our pedagogy can be seen to have a meaningfully political outcome. Thank you very much.
I'm wondering to what extent is this a documentary? And the decor he used, to what extent is it authentic to the real location, or is it something that just originated from his own imagination of the filmmaker? So is it more fiction than fact, or?
It's an interesting, I think it's a beautifully made film and really interesting kind of, but that's one of the some of the discussions that me and Joe had about kind of to what extent this warrants being called a documentary, or you might more broadly call it a non-fictional kind of, it's an imagining of what he might be doing. And he might killed loads of people and then kind of been doing the conga in his living room. Nobody really knows, but it's more likely, I guess, that this sort of thing was going on. But there was one moment where, towards the end of the extract I showed, where Christie's kind of there's a slight hand movement on his leg, and that was something that was empirically observed in the court, I think, was it Joe? Yeah, it's kind of reported in the court records, but Joe deliberated long and hard about, if I do that, and this private moment where he's sat in his kitchen. So it's taking something from one empirically observed fact and kind of injecting it there. So I totally take your point that it can be seen as not a documentary, perhaps not even, you might say, not a non-fiction film, because a lot of people might watch this if they've not had the contextualising remarks and just think, okay, it's some puppets sat there and it's all a bit quiet and so on, then without the kind of indexing, as Noel Carroll calls it, which predominantly, we know when we watch something that, I'm watching a fiction film, a documentary film, I'm watching a fiction film that's pretending to be a documentary, i.e. a mockumentary. So in this case, I think it's a kind of a limit case, a kind of a grey area, certainly. It's one of those films that it's an interesting one, even more than maybe Going Equipped, where you've got the kind of, even though you don't know who it is, there's a clear sense that you are listening to a real person who's being interpreted via the puppet. Was that another question?
It sort of raises the question whether we can observe reality without interpreting it. Are we ever able to do that? Is it possible to put together a story that doesn't include our interpretation of the story?
Yeah, I would say no, it isn't. But I do tend to agree. I think broadly with thinkers who say, we can't kind of step outside of our interpretation. But I don't then go as far as some people saying, if we can't step outside of an interpretation, therefore everything's a free-for-all. There's no such thing as kind of a factual instance that we can, I think what needs to be clarified is when something is an interpretation, it's a version of, this is an interpretation of a particular instance of something that happened, of a real person, of a set of events or facts. And then you can say, okay, you're interpreting it in that way, and it's quite broadly how people construct histories. You say, I'm interpreting what actually happened, but from a certain perspective, and somebody can come in and debate with you on that kind of level, rather than it being, here is my objective representation of something. You say, no, it's just your interpretation, and in a way, you're kind of both arguing from different premises there. So I'd certainly say that you can't really exist outside of interpretation. What's interesting in animations, in the realm of animation, is that it foregrounds the very notion of interpretation by somebody has actually constructed these sets, done those drawings, stitched those embroideries. So it kind of, through the very basis of the craft of the process, it kind of foregrounds the interpretive elements as well. Yeah.
So it seems to me that another component that's really important is how the filmmaker, the animator, communicates to the audience what the intention is, and if, for example, with the 10 mark, which I So, you can't hear me. I'll say it over again. It seems to me that it's important for the filmmaker or the animator to communicate with the audience what their intention is regarding the content of the piece. So if it's animated and it has these non-indexical qualities or indexical things that are rearranged and recomposed, recontextualized, how does the filmmaker communicate that their intent is to reflect on a real-world experience, that it's not invented, it's not fictionalized. And so that, it seems to me that if you're doing this in animation, you've displaced indexicality, your dependence on indexicality to communicate the fact of documentariness, and therefore you need to be thinking of some other strategy to communicate your anchor with the real world. And it's just sort of an open question about strategy and kind of, as a filmmaker, how one would think about making that point really clear to the audience if you want them to be.
Yeah.
And that's a political thing, to make a decision to communicate to your audience. I want you to think about this in this certain way. That's my intent.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's an interesting one that, you know, if you want to do, you put something intrinsic, you know, put something actually in the text that cues the viewer to, yes, this is a documentary. And you know, with something like the 10 mark, it could have been some minimal number maybe, but some caption, something that's explanatory. I showed a bit of this at a different conference, a live action documentary conference, well, expressly on live action, but acting with facts. The University of Reading, and Brian Winston said, he came in at the end, he asked the same sort of questions, you know, how can you know, is this a documentary? And he was playing sort of devil's advocate, but, you know, and then he said that he came up to the end and said it just needs a caption at the end. And I told Joe about this, that, because I haven't said about the significance of the title. Christie apparently said he killed 8 women, was it, Joe? Was it 8? 8, yeah. And he apparently said, I always thought I would stop killing when I got to the 10 mark, which is kind of, you know, sort of a chilling matter-of-fact sort of statement to make. But, and that's what Brian Winston said. He said it just needs a caption at the end. You know, you go through this kind of process of thinking, who's this, what are they doing, why is it a puppet, and so on and so forth. But then at the end you get this kind of sucker punch of, you know, John, and maybe you watch it and think, yeah, I still don't know who John Christie is, but then you think, okay, he was obviously a killer, and it's a prompt to then learn more, which a lot of documentaries, I think, function in that kind of way. There's no documentary filmmakers, perhaps the most arrogant one might think, I want somebody to learn everything about the subject matter from my film, and they're always a kind of kick up the arse, as it were, to go and find out more about, you know, the problems in Iran or whatever the case might be. So, but in terms of, yeah, the intentionality of the filmmaker and how the filmmaker kind of, I think there was a definite, interestingly, kind of critical, reflective resistance to that from Joe in the 10 mark. He kind of wanted to play with this idea of not telling the audience, not kind of, you know, and play with that notion of, you know, making something that's non-fictional, but I'm kind of, you know, to my mind anyway, my interpretation of it is being a bit bloody minded, you know, but in an interesting and useful way. So, yeah, it's an intriguing question about how you tip off the audience, or in some ways how you might fool the audience deliberately. And obviously, mock documentaries play on that kind of, you know, walk that particular tightrope where they, you know, they want the audience to say, the filmmaker wants us to think this is a documentary, but they want us to recognise that it's not really a documentary. It's something that's pretending to be a documentary. You know, so you get that kind of dance being done between the film, the documentarist, and the audience. Not sure if that answered the question or not. It just sort of.
Sorry, but that's all we have time for right now. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
So just by way of brief intro here, I thought rather than giving the biographies, I'd rather just sort of frame the session a little bit. The biographies are in the conference handout, so you can read the bios yourself. So in Instead, I want to remind you the title of the session, Animated Documentary and the Spectacular. And note the wonderfully strange conjunction of these terms. Documentary and spectacle, terms which would normally be opposed to each other, but an opposition no less relevant today as it was when de Boer first raised it in 1967, and again 20 years later in his sequel to that, A Commentary on the Society of Spectacle, published in 1988. The session title implies rather strongly that animation pushes documentary in the direction of spectacle. So I hope you will prepare, as you listen to these talks, questions about the strange alliance in the term spectacular documentary. To grease the wheels of your questions, I want to suggest a few questions that we might begin considering. I think we might listen to Gurevitch's paper, The Documentary Attraction, Animation, Simulation, and the Rhetoric of Expertise, with the following question in mind. What makes simulated rhetorics of expertise attractive? We don't have Charles daCosta, as was just pointed out, but nonetheless, I think I'll just mention a question relative to what would have been his talk. What would we want to stir? I'm sorry, the title of his paper was Stirring It Up, Priming the Ordinary and Prodding the Invisible into the Animated Spectacle. Relative to that title, we might ask, why would we want to stir, prime, and prod the ordinary or the invisible into spectacular visibility? Bella Honess Rose suggests with her title, Spectacular Reality, the pleasurable tensions of surface, content, and context in animated documentary, this question. If reality is now spectacle itself, what role does pleasure play in how we resolve or don't? The tensions between truth of surface, truth of content, truth of context. Gurevitch's attraction to daCosta's Stirring It Up and Honess Rose's Pleasure suggests that animation's contribution to documentary lies in its affective power to persuade, and therefore just maybe to act on the expertise, revelation, and tensions with which animation challenges and/or reinforces truth. Do I detect in these titles an uncertainty of effect, perhaps an ambivalence about the strange, unsettling conjunction of animation with documentary forms? We hope that your questions and comments will address these dilemmas. I hope you'll focus some of your questions on the questions I've just posited in order to find similarities and differences between how our speakers address them or don't. So with that, we'll just have Leon speak first, and Bella will follow that, and I think we'll just wait for questions after they both speak. So, Leon.
Expecting it to be very grand and big panel sessions, and there was 5 of us in a room for about 3 days, and I was like, oh. And I came here expecting it to be about 5 in a room. I've got a full lecture hall. Okay, so the documentary attraction, it's a little bit disingenuous to call this the documentary attraction, because what I'm interested in is the attraction, how the digital attraction functions in a way that pertains to documentary, but not necessarily. I'm going to look at more than just documentaries, so you'll see what I mean in a minute. Just one of the first things I'm going to say is I gave a presentation about a year ago on the cinema of attractions, and to a film and television department, and afterwards somebody turned around to me and said, you really should have outlined Tom Gunning and what his main argument was, which kind of surprised me because I thought everyone would know Tom Gunning by now. But so I'm just going to very briefly go into where I start with this, and very briefly give you a sketch out of Tom Gunning. So one of the things about Tom Gunning and the impact he had upon film studies with his cinema of attractions thesis was of course, that he kind of rewrote the approach to cinema based on early cinema as an attraction rather than purely a narrative form. And often what has been looked at with Gunning is, of course, how his early attractions featured as spectacle, and of course how that relates to contemporary computer-generated imaging. And what I find interesting is the way in which Gunning has been picked up and used in Hollywood film, or as a means of understanding Hollywood film. And yet, at the same time, one aspect of his Cinemas and Attractions article was to look at actualities, to point out the fact that early cinema was more often actuality, a kind of pre-narrative form of documentary, than it was spectacle in terms of as a narrative form. So, I have a quote here. So he points out that early cinema was not dominated by the narrative impulse that later asserted its sway over the medium. First, there is the extremely important role that actuality film plays in early film production. Investigation of films copyrighted in the US shows actuality films outnumbered fictional films until 1906. So I think there's something that's not looked at. I'm sorry for the quality of this image. This is the famous one of people leaving a factory, one of the earliest movies made in the late 1890s. But it's just an aspect, I think, that's not often looked at, or not often given enough kind of credence, is the degree to which, of course, the attraction was also fundamentally connected to a documentary form at the inception of cinema. And of course, so you had all of these examples like the train leaving the station or entering the station, the exiting factory, the sneeze, waterfalls, these kind of endless, the endless footage you get in Edison films of the natural world, photographed purely for the spectacle of the natural world alone. And what does that have to do with contemporary animation, contemporary CGI? One of the arguments I've made previously is that if you can say that there was a cinema of attractions in the first half of the 20th century, one of the things that we could argue is that there's a cinemas of transactions now, and that this is to do with computer-generated imaging and the ways in which computer-generated imaging and animation functions as a kind of exchangeable currency. It's a currency that gets transferred across media forms. So this famous scene from the Titanic, for instance, was used endlessly. It was actually conceptualized as an advert for the White Star Line, which is what the CG animators say, that Rob Legato, who was James Cameron's animation production manager on this. And he says it was an advert, but also what's important is that it was made to be used in news features about the Titanic. It was used in the trailers, it was used in the television spot adverts, and so what you've got is this sense of kind of attractions, CGI attractions that kind of move across different forms. And just very briefly, to kind of outline this a little bit more, is that you can see kind of CG attractions on the digital animation on the left. These are all adverts, and on the right, these are all moments in movies, and you can see them kind of. I don't think it's necessarily important to draw parallels in terms of saying, well, one was responsible for the other. I think your CG animation teams are frequently working across industries, and they're frequently. One of the things I think is interesting is that in advertising, people have more scope to experiment sometimes than they do in Hollywood when you've got a $200 million budget and no scope from the newcomer. Whereas with adverts, you're not necessarily worrying about box office receipts. And just finally, the last example is on the left. What you've got here are they're kind of pseudo-documentary in a way, I guess, that they're promotional animation, and they're promotional animation generally used to get money for projects. So, for instance, Airbus, or you might have architects competing with each other to make Olympic stadiums, and they will lock up these CGI. And that the aesthetics of these and the ways in which they function are kind of similar to the ways in which they function in Hollywood movies. Now, that's the end of my Hollywood movie section. Just one last thing I want to point out though is that one of the things that's quite often attention's been brought to with the attraction, the digital attraction, especially if you look at someone like Stephen Bottomwise, he argues that one of the aspects of the attraction, that one of the ways that this spectacle functioned was people looked for ever greater levels of verisimilitude, ever greater levels of a kind of surprise at what seemed realistic. He says that the phrase he uses is apparently real, no matter how unreal they knew it to be. This was an attraction. He says that this is a process that goes throughout cinematic imaging history. What I want to look at is the opposite, actually. I want to look at the computer-generated animation, the attraction, as it functions with less verisimilitude. And that is to say that the aesthetics aren't constantly aiming at photorealism. The aesthetics aren't constantly aiming at surprising the audience with something that seems real no matter how unreal it appears to be. And what I want to suggest is that there's a kind of relationship between aesthetics, realist aesthetics, I guess, and the rhetoric of expertise and simulation. So, for instance, what we can see, and I've got advert examples which I'll play at the end if we've got time, if we want to see them. But I've got you see, for instance, adverts by people like Chevron, companies like Chevron and Shell. And what you have is these moments in these adverts where suddenly you get this CGI, you get this kind of attraction. It's very much, the rest of the adverts all filmed, and then suddenly you'll move into this space in which they suggest that they are experts in drilling deep wells. I mean, this one's incredibly ironic actually, because the claim they make is that they're fantastically amazing because they've managed to be drilling deeper than anyone ever thought in the Gulf with no accidents whatsoever today. It's kind of been pulled that advert now since the accident in the Gulf of Mexico. But what's interesting to me is that this isn't just an attraction. It doesn't just feature like other digital attractions you see, say, in Hollywood. The aesthetic here is pared down, it's stripped back. You can see the wireframe graphics. And so in a way, I think there's a kind of index of wireframe graphics equaling simulation and equaling physics and equaling mathematics, almost kind of signifying these things. And the concept that high definition aesthetics, photorealistic aesthetics here, would compromise the signal of expertise that they're trying to send out. Here's another example. This is the Shell advert. It's called the Snake Straw. It's both Shell and Chevron are kind of trying to go on a publicity drive on why they're not, why peak oil is not a problem, because they will continue to find more oil even though it's more difficult to find. And what you get in both are these moments where you've got experts pointing to these graphics and pointing to the physics of it. And it doesn't just happen in the Shell advert. I noticed that there's this really interesting moment at the beginning of Titanic in which they James Cameron essentially shows you exactly what's going to happen at the end of the movie. And you have this exactly the same moment where you've got these specialists showing you exactly what's going to happen, but just in lower definition graphics, I guess, with pared back aesthetics. And it's almost like what's happening here is the audience is being convinced that the experts here can give credence to then the spectacle that they can sit back and relax and watch. But I think it's very interesting that there's a kind of bookend in Titanic with this rhetoric of expertise with pared down wireframe simulation, and then you've got the kind of actual Hollywood CGI at the other end of the film. So what I'm trying to look at here then is, what I'm interested in is the digital attraction of simulation, and simulation as an index of expertise. And aesthetics, what I'm going to call aesthetics and contextual verisimilitude, which is, it depends what the verisimilitude is that you're trying to convince the audience of. So if you're trying to convince the audience that they're looking at photorealistic animation of something that is indistinguishable from film, that's one thing. And then if you're trying to convince your audience that what they're looking at is something that's scientifically correct, then that's something else. So you've got different contextual verisimilitude or different aesthetics, depending on the context of the type of verisimilitude you're trying to push. Well, this was just interesting to me because these are both animators, and what you find, and these are just two examples, but you find animators endlessly will talk about this. They'll constantly talk about trying to sell the audience and trying to convince the audience that something is real. Like, there's this wonderful bit that John Nelson says, that he says, I think conceptually, if you do that, if you sell to the audience the belief that you're in the Colosseum with photorealistic special effects, it's like knocking out the bully of the schoolyard. You've got them for the whole of the rest of the movie. So I think there's something going on here with the selling to an audience. Now this is all, and this was the example I had. I should have slided that in earlier. And the same thing happened interestingly with Michael Bay and Jerry Bruckheimer. They used this wireframe type graphics to convince the military, the US military, to give them lots of logistical support for making Pearl Harbor. And they talked about the military top brass seeing these kind of mocked up special effects and being very overwhelmed by it. And again, I think there's something interesting here about the ways in which CGI, pared down CGI, it actually is used as a selling point in other ways other than what we're used to thinking about with Hollywood movies. This was what they transferred into later on. And finally, and because I'm still kind of working through these ideas, this is the last example I've got, which is in Loose Change. And I noticed in Loose Change, and there's another documentary, and I couldn't for the life of me find it, which was it was a National Geographic documentary that almost responded to this one. And they had a fire engineer and a structural engineer using graphics to dispute Loose Change. So you've got these two documentaries, you've got Loose Change and you've got the opposite in the National Geographic documentary. And what you have are, again, these moments, like for instance in Loose Change, when they're trying to convince you that there's a plot against the Pentagon, that this plane couldn't have ever really crashed into the Pentagon like this because it would have been nearly impossible. Or also that the plane went through the building and the plane wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have been possible for the plane to collapse the buildings, is the line being taken in Loose Change. But what I found interesting is you've got these two moments in Loose Change where they signal this and they show you these pared down wireframe graphics. They show you these kind of less than realistic graphics. It's almost like a too high a level of photorealism would be damaging to their claims. It would be it would undermine. And I've never done this in a conference paper before. I'm going to reference something that's very unacademic, because if any of you can give me examples of research that says this is more academic, I'd be delighted to know. Which is, there's a moment in Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance where he argues that there's a fundamental distinction between romanticism and classicism. That with romanticism, the romantic approach is always about aesthetics, it's about superficiality, and it's about the aesthetics, what is on the surface. And he says that
classical approaches to the world are about what lies underneath. That it's about a kind of enlightenment process of empirical science. And in a way, I think that there's something going on with this CG animation that you can see. That if you look at Titanic sinking at the end, and it looks like a romantic painting. You look at most CGI, and you've got kind of neo-baroque and romantic aesthetics there. But if you look at the kind of pared down wire-framed aspects, it's almost like it's appealing to a classical aesthetic, a classical approach to mining underneath the surface, mining underneath the superficiality of the graphics. And that's me. So any comments on that? I'd be very grateful to hear any more respectable research on that. Thank you very much.
I
So just while it's loading up, I just want to echo what Liam was just saying. It's so fantastic to see so many people here in the room right now, but in the room earlier today for Paul's keynote. I just think it demonstrates something that I've been thinking the last couple of years, that we've really reached a kind of tipping point with the study of animated documentary. A kind of critical mass is going on at the moment. When I think back to when I first started thinking and writing about this about 5 or so years ago, you know, I could refer to Paul Wells, Paul Ward, Sheila Sophia, and those kind of vanguard, really were the forward guard in the study of animated documentary. And now, you know, last year when I went to conferences here in Visible Evidence, the documentary conference, and Society for Cinema Studies, there are just so many panels and papers on animated documentary, as demonstrated by the fact that we can have a whole conference on it. There's an edited collection that's been edited by Mark, who's chairing our panel, and Jeffrey Scholar, that's coming out hopefully in the autumn. Fingers crossed, definitely in the autumn. So for me, who is deeply interested and passionate about animated documentary, it's really fantastic. Okay, so my paper today is an exploration of ideas from my doctoral work, which I finished a couple of years ago. And I'm sort of beginning to kind of expand and explore beyond what I did in that thesis. So this paper is very much a work in progress, and I'm trying out some new ideas, I'm probing some new areas of inquiry, so I really would welcome any feedback on what I've got to say over the next 20 minutes. So there is perhaps by definition always a visual excess to be contended with in animated documentary. The animated image is something beyond, something more than the live-action image of conventional documentary. And just to note, here as a kind of shorthand, I'm using conventional documentary in distinction to animated documentary. And conventional documentary can take many forms, from kind of fly-on-the-wall observation, to talking heads, to reconstruction, and even to performed musical numbers. But it is, importantly, recorded by a camera. Conventional documentaries generally invite us to look through the screen. I think here I'm echoing something that Paul was quoting from John Coyne earlier today. So they invite us to look through the screen, through the image, to the reality that is represented. This is in part by virtue of the indexicality of the filmed image and the attendant status of documentary films as witness and evidence to what happens in front of the camera. This is emphasised by John Corner's suggestion that a documentary is considered good if it engenders discussion of its subject, not of itself. So in conventional documentary, we're not supposed to be looking at the image, we're supposed to be looking through it to the social, political, historical and personal issues it may refer to. Okay, so here I am of course grossly oversimplifying things, and recent scholarship, notably from Keith Beattie and Elizabeth Cowie in their respective books, has drawn our attention to the significant existence of spectacle in documentary. But animated documentary seems to stray particularly far from this idea of documentary image as window. The image in animated documentaries goes beyond merely representing reality. It is not a window we can look through to the real world. It is constructed. It has been created by hand or digitally, frame by frame. The animated image stands in relationship of both absentia and excess to the index, as I've said before. The visual evidence witnessed by the documentary camera is absent, and in its place is an animated image that must be reconciled by the viewer. But animated documentaries are, as I've contended also elsewhere, documentaries by virtue of being about the world rather than a world. This is a really useful distinction made by Bill Nichols in terms of Huxley's making a distinction between documentary and fiction film. So, in animated documentaries, there is an always already existing tension between the surface of the image and the subject of the film, or between spectacle and reality. On the one hand, we notice the image and its fabrication. On the other hand, we are relating this to a reality to which this image refers. So what I'm interested in exploring in my paper today is how this tension between surface and content, between spectacle and referent, is simultaneously complicated and resolved in and for animated documentaries. I argue this happens to a certain extent in the text itself, but also significantly and curiously and interestingly, and often quite weirdly, in the extra-textual media that surrounds it. That is, things such as making of documentaries about documentaries, in itself a very weird concept. Filmmaker websites, DVD commentary tracks, interviews, reviews, conversations with filmmakers, and so on. The extra textual, I suggest, invites us to marvel at the animated documentary image and at its technological and artistic construction, whilst at the same time working to authenticate the animated documentary as a representation of reality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore this tension in some examples of animated documentary, looking at the films and also how they've been presented extra-textually. I'm going to look at some examples of documentaries that use animation in mimetic substitution, that is, to stand in for missing live action in a way that resembles its codes of realism. I'll also look at examples of animated documentary where the animation is embraced as an expressive, evocative, and visually distinct medium. Then at the end, I'll make some tentative suggestions regarding the implications for the animated documentary spectator. So spectacle is something that's more usually associated with fiction film than documentary. In fiction film, it usually functions, as suggested by Laura Mulvey, as a moment of excess that stands outside the progression of the narrative. The classic example being song and dance numbers in musicals. Andrew Darley points out that spectacle is, quote, largely vision-centered and is about direct and immediate sensual pleasures, end quote. There is then a supposed depthlessness that goes with spectacle. This harks back to the board, as Mark was indicating. This depthlessness that goes with spectacle. Spectacle is about surface pleasures that activates us on the level of sensation rather than activating us cognitively on the deeper level, supposedly deeper level of meaning and knowledge. As a result, as Keith Beattie has observed, spectacle is generally distrusted in documentary studies scholarship, something he, following Brian Winston, attributes to that looming shadow of the Griersonian approach to documentary as sober, expository tool of education and persuasion. Cowie and Beattie both oppose this position, both suggesting that documentary spectacle has epistemological potential. In particular, they make links between spectacle, the pleasure of the visual, and a desire to know reality. This recalls the historical fascination with realist spectacles such as panoramas and wax museums, which I'll return to shortly. So now I'm going to look at the spectacular within animated documentaries. Firstly, documentaries that use animations to substitute for missing live action. So Walking with Dinosaurs, my favourite go-to example for this kind of substitutive animation, impresses us on a most basic level. So this is the 1999 BBC natural history series I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It impresses us on a most basic level by bringing something dead back to life, hoping perhaps that the moving images of living, breathing dinosaurs may evoke a reaction similar to this, if we remember this, that much maligned moment of emoting by Laura Dern, the paleobiologist Dr. Ellie Sattler in Jurassic Park. The series is also packed with sweeping vistas, aerial shots, wide-angle shots, such as this, and images that are generally intended to provoke awe, and as Karen D. Scott has termed it, wonderment. The BBC's more recent Wonders of the Solar System, and I guess you could also say Wonders of the Universe, utilises similar tactics to incite, as the title suggests, wonder at the vastness of the solar system, as well as delight at viewing high-quality CGI imagery of far-off planets and stars that are impossible to see through other means. And finally, the History Channel's Battle 360, a documentary series about the World War II aircraft carrier, the US Enterprise, features hyperkinetic displays and computer game-style aesthetics, such as superimposing grids, charts, and compass bearings on the screen. And I'm just going to see if you can watch this.
USS Enterprise, a fighting city of steel. She is the most revered and decorated ship of World War II. On this 360-degree battlefield, where threats loom on the seas, in the skies, and in the ocean depths, the Enterprise's enemies could be anywhere and everywhere. There's nowhere.
Very kinetic, very raw. Okay, so all three three examples invite us to notice the image as a thing in itself, take pleasure in it, enjoying its spectacle. However, in all cases, the animation is integrated seamlessly within realist codes of filmic representation. The ontological complexity of the image, as Craig Height has noticed, is elided. Walking with Dinosaurs uses CGI to copy tropes of natural history programming, such as telephoto cinematography, night vision image enhancement, as in this still from episode 5, and spontaneous encounters with camera subjects, as in episode 6, when the camera is tracking a T-Rex and it suddenly kind of turns around and roars in the lens of the camera and spraying it with spittle. Wonders of the Solar System melds live action, presented by the nation's favourite physicist, Brian Cox, photographic images captured through telescope technology and CGI, so that the CGI becomes to a certain extent invisible, identifiable only because we know, for example, that such close-up images of Saturn are impossible. Battle 360 blurs the distinction between computer animation and live-action imagery, in particular archive footage. So frequently, the sharp clarity of the digital image gives way to sepia tones and a grainy, blotchy texture, one that mimics the look of decayed film from the period. So you can see here the kind of lines down the image and the kind of blotches to what is essentially digitally CGI constructed footage to make it look like it was of the period. This tension between the illusion and spectacle, is presented also in animated documentaries that do not mimic the look of live-action documentary. In this type of animated documentary, the animation becomes a tool of evocation that facilitates our imagination, often of someone else's subjective experience of the world. These films play on their medium specificity, doing things and offering something aesthetically that live-action cannot. I'm sure you're all familiar with these examples already. In Ryan, filmmaker Chris Landreth conveys both his own subjectivity and that of his subject, animator Ryan Larkin, through 3D computer-generated animation. This film is a really intriguing combination of the photorealistic and the evocative, the latter achieved through stylistic embellishments that help us see the world from the filmmaker and his subject's point of view. And embellishments are, of course, meant to be noticed. They're meant to draw our attention to the image itself, in this case. Samantha Moore's An Eye Full of Sound, which I'm sure she'll talk about later today, evokes rather than represents the experience of synesthesia, in particular the triggering of sight through sound. Its combination of musical score, documentary interview soundtrack, and often abstract animated visuals, as you can see here, creates a kind of audio-visual melange that helps us imagine synesthesia. We have to notice the animated imagery in this film, and our attention to it is vital for our spectatorial experience. As the film begins, for example, it may seem to us that there is little connection between what we see on screen and the words we hear being spoken by the interviewees. That is, until we begin to realise that Moore's images are responding to the musical score in the way that a synesthete's brain will trigger images in response to sounds. I hope I got that right, Sam. While both Ryan and An Eye Full of Sound demonstrate the animated image as spectacle, they also present as cohesive films through the integration of documentary sound and animation, and in Ryan, certain visual documentary elements. Animated imagery is unproblematic, these films suggest, at the same time as requiring we pay attention to it, and notice it, appreciate it for its medium specificity as non-indexical, non-filmed imagery. Okay, so that's the films themselves, articulated through a few examples, although I think you can carry out this reading on any animated documentary. Where things get really interesting, I think, is if you start looking extra-textually, and my favourite example of this is the behind-the-scenes making-of documentary that aired alongside the Walking with Dinosaurs series. This special was screened 2 days after the premiere of episode 1 on BBC One. The timing coincided with the first reviews of that episode and effectively responds to these prior to the broadcast of the second episode. The making-of works to authenticate the content of the series, something that was called into doubt by expert commentators from the science community due to the series' prevalence to present hypothesis as fact. It does this by recruiting various figures of authority, such as paleontologists and geologists, who obliquely corroborate the claims being made in the series. In fact, they sort of often very overtly defend the claims being made in the series. But the special episode also reveals the ghost in the machine, as it were, of the series through segments revealing the CGI production process. And not only this, but how much work, skill, and technology is required to create the images. So I've just got a couple of clips from that making that special. Such immaculate.
Well, we've got a huge task ahead of us. These are creatures that haven't walked for over 60 million years. We have to find a way to bring them back to life and have everybody believe that they are walking with the dinosaurs. The fruits of the sculptor's labour were about to take on a new life inside the computer. They first had to be scanned by a laser which probed every nook and cranny to transfer the physical models to virtual ones. They would have to be taught how to walk, run, and swim. And some of them would even have to fly. And so all this expertise was slowly put into practice as the characters were animated limb by limb. The pterosaur was shortly flying again, tentatively at first, but it would soon get the hang of it. Others turned out to be more difficult.
Animating the Tyrannosaurus is quite tricky because it's basically a 5-ton sort of bird, really, and trying to get the weight into his feet. So I've got to do lots of squash and stretch around his feet and ankles to try and make him look heavy.
Well, this is tricky.
I mean, there's a whole bag of stuff I think that you can say about the making of that section of it as well. I mean, the use of music, anthropomorphization of the dinosaurs, but I'll leave that to one side for now. So in those segments that show this kind of celebration of the labour and technology, we're once again, animated documentaries are recalling the realist genres that were popular at the end of the 19th century. Vanessa Schwartz has noted in her discussion of panoramas in Fin de Siècle of Paris that spectators marvelled not only at the subjects represented, but at the means of representation and its technological illusionism. Michael O'Prey has compared the style of photorealism to Trompe l'oeil paintings, in that the part of the appeal comes from our thrill at the virtuosity of the means of representation itself. So the Walking with Dinosaurs series invites wonder at the CGI images, and the Making of documentary invites pleasure in the skill of constructing the spectacle. At the same time, the Making of documentary is authenticating the content of the series, and the series itself presents animated imagery via an aesthetic of photorealism. Interviews with Chris Landreth, as well as his voiceover commentary on the Ryan DVD, similarly draw our attention to the process, labour and skill involved in the film's production. From this extra textual material, we learned that Landreth recruited animation students to make the film, the type of software they used, and so on. At the same time, Landreth authenticates his representation of Ryan Larkin. For example, he validates various aesthetic characteristics of the film, such as pointing out that the representations of two of the film's interviewees were based on drawings made by Ryan Larkin himself, and telling us that the film's final scene, in which we see Larkin panhandling on a Montreal street, is a faithful recreation, as he puts it. Information about An Eyeful of Sound that has been conveyed to me textually through conversations with Sam, as well as hearing her talk about the film, corroborates her approach as a valid way of representing the experience of synesthesia. Moore reports that one of the participants in the film said that her husband, after seeing the film on the big screen, finally seemed to understand the synesthesia, presumably in a way that this participant could never actually explain to her husband. Another participant showed clips of the film to her friends whenever they came round to explain what synesthesia is like. These anecdotes not only authenticate the film, but also make a case for animation being a better means of sharing these types of experiences with the general audience, perhaps even your husband. But we can also learn of the challenges Moore faced in making this film, in particular the task of incorporating feedback from participants as to the accuracy of her animated depictions of their perception of the world. So in conclusion, Elizabeth Cowie, Bill Nichols, Phil Rosen, amongst others, remind us that the epistemological and evidential weight of documentary images depends on extra-textual validation, and I think this speaks to the question that Paul received this morning. That we require this kind of extra-textual validation of something as a documentary. This comes from filmmakers, producers, broadcasters, critics, reviews, advertising material. A documentary only gains meaning as such if we know it's a documentary, as our cultural interest in the revelation of documentary fakery demonstrates. In animated documentaries, as I've shown, the extra-textual articulates the tension between spectacle and knowledge, wonder and authenticity, a tension that is already present in the films. Our attention is drawn to the surface of the image by virtue of its aesthetic properties, and we are often extra-textually reminded of the constructive nature of the image and the technical and artistic mastery involved in its creation. Concomitantly, animated images are presented within a cohesive animated documentary that claims very much a relationship with the world, a status that is authenticated extra-textually. This creates, I would suggest, a pleasurable tension for the viewer, at least it's very pleasurable for me. We are not duped by animated documentaries. We know they're animated, yet from them we also gain an accurate knowledge and beliefs about the world. I sure as hell know a lot more about synesthesia since watching Sam's film than I did before, so I've learnt something through watching that film. We're not overwhelmed by their ontological and epistemological complexity, I don't think. Instead, this enhances the pleasurable spectatorial position these films create. There is a delight in knowing that those dinosaurs are animated, and quite how tricky it was to do so, while at the same time marvelling at quite how realistic they really do look. Well, at least they did in 1999, not so much now. Similarly, which is an interesting question in itself, similarly, there is a pleasurable kind of ha in learning Chris Landers' production process that went into create the images that offer us such insight into his, if not also Ryan Larkin's, take on the world. We know these images are not quote-unquote real in the documentary indexical evidence sort of way, but they still have a very real impact on what we learn, both cognitively and emotionally from these films. So, as Sergei Eisenstein has observed of the viewing experience created by Disney cartoons, we know that they are drawings and not living beings. We know that they are projections of drawings on a screen. We know that they are miracles and tricks of technology, that such beings don't really exist. But at the same time, we sense them as alive. We sense them as moving and active. We sense them as existing and even thinking. There is, as suggested by Eisenstein's tone, a certain pleasure to be found in the very tension between the cognitive and the sensuous that is particularly articulated in animated documentaries, both textually